The air inside the cannery is thick with the scent of brine and the rhythmic industrial thud of heavy machinery. It is December 1944. Outside, the Texas wind howls across the flat expanse of Camp Hearne, rattling the barbed wire that separates two worlds. Inside, under the hum of dim, incandescent bulbs, a group of German prisoners moves with a precision that feels unnatural. Among them, a young corporal named Carl slips a jagged shard of discarded tin into the lining of his heavy wool coat. His eyes dart toward the guard tower, where the silhouette of an American MP looms against the searchlight's glare. For weeks, the inventory at the cannery hasn't added up. Hundreds of empty cans, meant for the scrap heap or the furnace, have vanished into the shadows of the barracks. In the commander's office, a map is pinned to the wall, marked with the locations of high-security risks. To the American officers, missing metal in a prisoner of war camp means only one thing: improvised grenades, shivs, or signaling devices for a coordinated breakout. The tension is a physical weight, a coiled spring waiting for the slightest friction to snap. As Carl steps out into the freezing night, the crunch of snow beneath his boots sounds like a countdown, leading directly into a landscape defined by the deepest suspicions of the Second World War. To understand the volatile atmosphere of the cannery in late 1944, one must first look at the sheer scale of the prisoner of war phenomenon on American soil. By this stage of the conflict, the United States had become a massive, unintended reservoir for the shattered remnants of the Third Reich. Following the collapse of the Africa Corps in 1943 and the subsequent tidal wave of captures during the Normandy campaign, the Allied forces faced a logistical nightmare: what to do with hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers. The solution was the Liberty ship return voyage. Ships that had crossed the Atlantic, laden with Sherman tanks and rations, returned to the ports of New York and Virginia, filled with men in tattered field grey uniforms. By late 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners were dispersed across more than 500 camps, many of them situated in the rural heartlands of the South and Midwest. Among these, Camp Hearne in Texas stood as a sprawling monument to the Geneva Convention's mandates. It was a city behind wire, designed to hold the men who had once been the vanguard of Hitler's ambitions. But these were not merely soldiers. They were a cross-section of a society at war. Among the hardened SS ideologues were conscripted farmers, clerks, and craftsmen who had been plucked from their lives and thrust into a global conflagration they no longer believed they could win. The presence of these men on American soil created a surreal social experiment. In towns like Hearne, the local population was initially gripped by a mixture of curiosity and cold, hard fear. These were the Huns, the men their sons were dying to defeat in the Ardennes and the Hurtgen forest. The US government, however, saw an opportunity. With millions of American men overseas, the domestic labor force had evaporated. The Geneva Convention allowed for the labor of non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, provided the work was not dangerous and not directly related to the war effort. This led to the creation of the contract labor system, where prisoners were sent to work in local agriculture and processing plants, including the canneries. Inside the camps, the internal politics were as lethal as any battlefield. The Legentha camp sections were often divided by ideology. The hardliners, those still fanatically loyal to the Nazi cause, maintained a shadow government behind the wire. They conducted secret courts, punished those they deemed traitors for cooperating with the Americans, and constantly looked for ways to continue the war from within. For the American guards and the camp commanders, every day was a tightrope walk. They had to maintain order, prevent escapes, and ensure that the vital labor quotas were met, all while knowing that a single spark of rebellion could turn a quiet Texas town into a combat zone. The cannery where Carl and his comrades worked was more than just a place of labor. It was a site of constant surveillance. Every tool was accounted for, Every scrap of metal was weighed and tracked. In the eyes of the American military intelligence, a missing screwdriver was a weapon. A missing sheet of tin was a potential radio component or a part of a tunnel digging machine. The psychological pressure on the guards was immense. They were often men who had been deemed unfit for frontline service due to age or injury, yet they were tasked with guarding the very elite of the German army. This disparity created a culture of hypervigilance, where the slightest deviation from the norm was viewed through the lens of sabotage. As the winter of 1944 deepened, the news from Europe was grim. The Battle of the Bulge was beginning to flicker into life, and the American public was on edge. At Camp Hearne, the guards tightened their grip. The prisoners, sensing the shift in the wind, became more insular, more secretive. It was in this environment of mutual suspicion and rising stakes that the great tin theft began, a series of small, calculated disappearances of scrap metal that threatened to ignite a lethal confrontation between the captors and the captives. The strategic concerns of the US War Department in 1944 were not limited to the front lines in Belgium. They extended to the stability of the American interior. Every POW camp was a potential powder keg, and the labour program was the primary mechanism used to keep that powder dry. The logic was simple. A busy prisoner is a compliant prisoner. By placing German soldiers in canneries, fields and workshops, the US military hoped to drain their energy and provide a sense of purpose that superseded the urge to revolt. However, this strategy created a paradox. To work effectively, the prisoners needed access to tools, shears, hammers, and raw materials, the very items that could be repurposed for escape or violence. At Camp Hearne, the commander, a man seasoned by decades of military discipline, operated under a philosophy of total control. To him, the German prisoners were a monolithic entity of Teutonic efficiency and potential treachery. He viewed the cannery not as a workplace of rehabilitation, but as a high-risk sector of his command. Reports from the camp's internal censors suggested a growing restlessness. The prisoners were hearing rumours of the crumbling Reich, and the commander feared that desperation would lead to a last-stand mentality within the wire. This suspicion was amplified by the arrival of a new group of prisoners from the Italian frontmen who had seen the worst of the mountain fighting and were hardened against their captors. The military conditions within the camp were a mirror of the war's brutality. Rations were strictly controlled, and the work for pay system, which allowed prisoners to earn script for tobacco or sweets, was the only thing preventing total stagnation. Yet, even with these small comforts, the psychological toll of captivity was immense. The German soldiers were trapped in a loop of repetitive industrial labour, separated from their families by an ocean and a war that seemed to have no end. For the craftsmen among them, the former toy makers from Nuremberg or the clockmakers from the Black Forest, the mechanical drudgery of the cannery was a slow erosion of their identity. As December 1944 progressed, the American intelligence officers at Hearne noticed a disturbing trend. It wasn't just tin cans that were disappearing. Small quantities of solder, bits of wire, and discarded paint from the maintenance sheds were being funneled into the German barracks. In the logic of a high-security prison, this was the signature of a sophisticated sabotage cell. The guards speculated that the prisoners were building a transmitter to contact U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico, or perhaps crafting incendiary devices to level the cannery and halt local food production. The commander's response was to initiate a shadow audit. He ordered the cannery foreman to intentionally leave bait materials, damaged cans and extra wire to see how quickly they would be stolen and by whom. He was building a case for a mass disciplinary action, one that would strip the prisoners of their working privileges and return them to the barren monotony of the general compound. He wanted a clear reason to crack down, and the missing tin was providing him with the perfect ammunition. But while the Americans saw a conspiracy, The reality inside the barracks was far more complex. The tactical suspicion of the guards was about to collide with a hidden, deeply human motivation that the military mind was not prepared to comprehend. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of the Geneva Convention and the humanity of everyone involved, as the theft of simple tin cans became the catalyst for a silent, secret operation that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the spirit of the season. To understand the volatile chemistry of Camp Hearne, one must look past the uniforms and into the specific motivations of the men involved. This was not a singular story of captor versus captive, but a collision of different human perspectives, each shaped by the pressures of a world at war. From the perspective of American military intelligence, the theft of tin was a textbook red flag. In the manual of the Provost Marshal General, any unauthorized collection of metal by POWs was categorized as a preparation for escape or insurrection. The guards were trained to look for ingenuity maps drawn on the inside of chocolate wrappers or compasses hidden in buttons. They knew that a German soldier, especially one trained in rigorous mission-type tactics, was a master of improvisation. To the American officers, a missing tin can wasn't just trash. It was the raw material for a detonator casing, or the housing for a forbidden radio. This tactical paranoia was fueled by the belief that fanatical Nazi cells were being formed to carry out acts of terror behind Allied lines. Every missing shard of metal was treated as a potential instrument of death. Conversely, for the German prisoners, the theft was an act of psychological survival. Among the ranks at Hearne were men like Hans, a former metalworker from the Ruhr Valley, and Dieter, who had spent his youth in a woodworking shop in Bavaria. For these men, the cannery was a soul-crushing environment. The industrial process of the 1940s was brutal. The constant clatter of the seamer, the scalding steam of the retorts, and the endless repetition of packing meat or vegetables into silver cylinders. They were being reduced to biological components of a machine. By taking the scrap metal, the bleed of the factory, they were reclaiming their agency. They weren't just stealing tin, they were stealing back their identity as creators. In the darkness of the barracks, under the flickering light of a single smuggled candle, the jagged edges of a discarded soup can became a canvas for the only thing the war hadn't yet destroyed: their craftsmanship. The physical setting of the story played its own role. Camp Hearne was isolated, surrounded by the vast, flat cotton fields and post-oak savanna of central Texas. For the Germans, the scale of America was terrifying. Many had been told by propaganda that the US was a collapsing society. Instead, they found themselves in a land of seemingly infinite resources, where even the scraps they worked with were of a quality they hadn't seen in Germany for years. This environment created a strange form of cabin fever. The prisoners were trapped in a vacuum where the only way to mark the passage of time, specifically the approaching Christmas of 1944, was through the work of their hands. While the prisoners labored in the shadows, two other perspectives defined the mounting crisis: the rigid duty of the American leadership and the complex moral landscape of a community at war. Colonel Miller, governed by the book, viewed the POWs as a mathematical equation of risk management. He was under immense pressure to ensure that no German soldier escaped to sabotage the vital Texas railway lines or oil refineries. To Miller, any sign of softness was a dereliction of duty. He viewed the reported thefts not as petty larceny, but as a personal challenge to his authority. He believed that if he allowed the prisoners to pilfer tin today, they would be digging tunnels tomorrow. His objective was a clean camp, and the missing inventory was a stain he intended to scrub clean with a heavy hand. As December progressed, a profound psychological shift occurred within the wire. For the Germans, Weihnachten, Christmas, held a cultural weight that transcended the war. In the bunkers of Stalingrad or the deserts of Libya, They had always tried to find a way to mark the day. Now, in the safety of Texas, the irony was bitter. Simultaneously, the local townspeople of Hearne were experiencing their own quiet grief. Nearly every family in the county had a gold star in their window or a son missing in action. The local orphanage was overflowing, a direct result of the social displacements of the war years. The moral angle here is the silent, unacknowledged connection between the enemy in the camp and the suffering of the local civilians. Neither side was supposed to care for the other, yet the proximity of the holiday forced a confrontation with the enemy's humanity. The prisoners knew about the orphanage through the local workers at the cannery. They saw the poverty that persisted even in the land of plenty. This sparked a dangerous, beautiful idea: to use the stolen tin to bridge the gap between their status as captives and their identity as men of peace. To the guards, a tin can was a weapon. To the prisoners, it was a versatile medium. Using only tools fashioned from spoons, sharpened rocks, and stolen industrial shears, the German craftsmen were performing a kind of metallurgical alchemy. They were using the heat of the barracks stoves to soften the metal and the pigments from the cannery's labeling ink to provide color. This was trench art taken to a domestic extreme. The technology involved was primitive friction welding, hand crimping, and wire lacing, but the results were intricate. This highlights the ingenuity of the human mind when stripped of everything but the will to create. The very sabotage the Americans feared was actually a sophisticated feat of miniature engineering, turning the debris of the American war machine into the treasures of a child's Christmas. The breaking point arrived on the night of December 22nd, 1944. The Texas sky was a bruised purple, and a blue norther had swept across the plains, dropping the temperature toward freezing. Inside the cannery, the tension had reached a terminal velocity. For 3 days, the American guards had been conducting a silent count, tracking the exact number of tin sheets entering the floor versus the number of finished cans leaving it. The discrepancy was undeniable. Nearly 40 pounds of high-grade tin and a gallon of industrial red lacquer had vanished. At 10:15 p.m., Colonel Miller authorized Operation Chimney. It was a coordinated, unannounced raid on Barracks 4. As the prisoners were finishing their final shift, a convoy of jeeps screeched to a halt outside the barbed wire perimeter. Armed MPs, their bayonets fixed and flashlights cutting through the swirling dust, burst through the heavy wooden doors. The guards shouted commands that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. The German prisoners were shoved into the center of the room. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and something else, something sweet and metallic. Colonel Miller stepped into the barracks, his boots clicking rhythmically on the floorboards. He was searching for the hidden trapdoor, the hollowed-out bunk leg, or the loose floorboard that would reveal the weapons he was certain were being manufactured. To Miller, this was the moment of truth. He ordered his men to tear the mattresses apart. Straw and feathers filled the air like a mockery of the falling snow outside. He demanded to know where the weapons were, threatening the prisoners with the whole. Corporal Carl remained silent, his jaw locked. The silence was an admission of guilt in Miller's mind, and he gave the signal for the guards to begin prying up the floorboards near the central heating stove. The sound of the crowbar splintering the pine floorboards was like a gunshot in the cramped barracks. One board popped, then another. The guards reached into the dark crawl space beneath the floor, their gloved hands searching for the cold, heavy weight of steel or the wooden crates of an arsenal. Instead, they pulled out a burlap sack, then another. Miller commanded them to be opened. The MPs ripped the ties. Out tumbled a kaleidoscope of color that seemed impossible in the drab, grey world of the prison camp. There were no grenades. There were no shivs. Instead, the floor was suddenly covered in a miniature fleet of intricate toy cars, their wheels fashioned from carefully crimped tin can lids and their bodies painted with the stolen industrial red lacquer. There were dolls with articulated limbs made from wire and scrap cloth, their faces hand-painted with coal dust and berry juice. There were tiny mechanical carousels that actually spun, powered by clockwork springs salvaged from broken camp equipment. The barracks fell into a suffocating silence. The American guards, who a moment ago had been ready to suppress a riot, stood frozen. One MP picked up a small truck. It had Hearne Express painted on the side in perfect Gothic lettering. These were not the crude scrapings of a bored prisoner. They were masterpieces of folk art, born from hundreds of hours of clandestine labour. Miller's face went pale. He looked at the saboteurs, the men he had characterised as cold-blooded ideologues. He saw Carl, whose hands were covered in tiny, unhealed nicks and cuts from shaping the jagged tin. He saw the older prisoners, men who had been toy makers in civilian life, looking not with defiance, but with a profound, quiet exhaustion. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The missing materials hadn't been stolen to destroy, but to give. The prisoners had learned of the local orphanage's plight and had spent their nights in the freezing barracks to ensure that children they would never meet would have something to open on Christmas morning. Miller looked down at the contraband at his feet. The rigid structure of his military world collapsed in the presence of a tin doll. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he straightened his tunic, but the aggression was gone. He ordered his men to pack the items into his jeep. The prisoners remained motionless, fearing a confiscation and a trip to the furnace. But as Miller turned to leave, he stopped at the door. He didn't look back, but he spoke loud enough for the entire barracks to hear. The inventory discrepancy would be recorded as industrial waste. He told the men to get some sleep, noting they had an early shift at the cannery. The morning of December 24, 1944, broke with a crisp, biting clarity. Colonel Miller's jeep, loaded with the burlap sacks of tin treasures, pulled up to the gates of the local Hearne orphanage. There were no cameras, no press releases, and no official military record of the transaction. As the toys were distributed, the psychological impact on the camp's leadership was immediate and profound. The guards found their resolve softened by a crushing sense of perspective. Reports from the weeks following showed a marked decrease in disciplinary infractions. The hardliners within the camp found themselves silenced by the sheer moral weight of what their fellow soldiers had done. The weapons the Americans feared had turned out to be instruments of a different kind of power, the power to dismantle dehumanization. The strategic consequences were equally significant. Colonel Miller shifted his focus toward a more nuanced form of management. He realized that the prisoners were not a monolithic threat, but a group of individuals whose morale was tied to their sense of dignity. While the wire remained and the guards stayed in their towers, the atmosphere of Camp Hearne changed. The human cost of the silent truce remained hidden in the letters sent back to Germany. For men like Carl, the act of making the toys was a bittersweet reminder of the children they might never see again. The toys were a bridge, but the gap they crossed was one of profound loneliness and the looming shadow of a fatherland that was rapidly disappearing. The broader historical implications extend far beyond the fences of a single Texas camp. In the final months of the war, the United States military began to shift its doctrine regarding the millions of German prisoners in its care. The events at Hearne served as an informal pilot program for a process of re-education through exposure to democratic values and humanitarian ideals. In the decades following the war, many of the toys remained in the families of the children who received them. These artifacts represent a rare category of trench art domestic objects intended for a peaceful purpose. They are a testament to a shift in diplomacy, not the diplomacy of treaties, but the diplomacy of shared human experience. The toys became a symbol of the time the war stopped at the edge of a burlap sack. The story of the tin toys of Camp Hearne serves as a profound quietus to the thunder of the Second World War. History books are often dominated by the movements of armies, the strategies of generals, and the cold calculations of industrial output. Yet, in the microcosm of a Texas cannery, we find a truth that is perhaps more enduring, that humanity is not a resource that can be fully depleted, even by the most efficient machines of war. The toys' fragile, jagged, and painted with stolen pigments reveal a fundamental resilience in the human spirit. They suggest that even under the weight of total indoctrination and the bars of a prison cell, the impulse to create and to empathize remains an unbreakable constant. These men, labeled as the enemy and stripped of their freedom, found their greatest liberation not through an escape tunnel, but through the act of giving to the children of the very nation that held them captive. It is a reminder that in the darkness of conflict, the most radical act one can perform is an act of kindness. The silent truce at Hearne didn't change the course of the war, but it did change the world for a few dozen children on a cold Christmas morning in 1944. It forced a hardened military commander to see the men behind the uniforms, and it forced the prisoners to see the humans behind the wire. In the end, the rusted remains of these tin cars and dolls stand as monuments to a simple philosophical truth. War can occupy a territory, it can destroy a city, and it can imprison a body, but it cannot conquer the imagination of a soul that chooses to remember what it means to be human.